Most people think they know how Anne Boleyn died. A quick beheading, tragic but merciful. An end during those final 17 days in the Tower of London. But that sanitized version barely scratches the surface of what really happened. What Henry VIII orchestrated wasn't just an execution. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare, designed to break a woman's spirit before destroying her body. The horror began long before Anne ever saw that French sword. The horror began long before Anne ever saw that French sword. Henry had already set in motion a machine designed to crush not just Anne herself, but everything she represented. This wasn't about justice. This was about erasure. Let's start with something that might shock you. Anne Boleyn wasn't just randomly accused and quickly executed like some historical footnote. Her downfall was orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, spent months building a case so elaborate and so thorough that it would make modern prosecutors envious. But here's the thing that makes your skin crawl. Every single piece of evidence was fabricated. Think about that for a moment. The Queen of England, the mother of the future, Elizabeth I, was destroyed through lies so carefully constructed that they convinced an entire kingdom she deserved to die. The charges against her were so outrageous they bordered on the absurd. Adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother. Conspiracy to murder the king. Witchcraft. These weren't crimes she committed. They were stories crafted to justify what Henry had already decided to do. But the real torture began when Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace on May 2nd, 1536. Picture the scene. One moment she's the Queen of England, commanding servants, making decisions that affect an entire nation. The next, she's being marched through corridors she once ruled, past courtiers who won't meet her eyes, toward a barge that will carry her to the Tower. The Tower of London wasn't just a prison. It was a place where hope went to die. Anne knew this better than most. She'd seen enemies of the crown disappear behind those walls, never to emerge alive. But here's what makes her situation uniquely horrifying. 3 years earlier, she had stayed in these exact same chambers while preparing for her coronation. The rooms where she once planned her triumph as queen were now her prison cells. During those 17 days of imprisonment, Anne experienced something that modern psychologists would recognize as systematic psychological torture. Sleep deprivation, isolation from supporters, constant interrogation, and perhaps most cruelly, being forced to listen to detailed fabrications about her alleged crimes. Imagine hearing strangers describe in graphic detail sexual encounters that never happened, relationships that existed only in the minds of your accusers. The interrogations weren't just about extracting confessions. They were about breaking Anne's sense of reality itself. When you're told repeatedly that you've committed crimes you know you never committed, when every aspect of your life is twisted into evidence of guilt, when even your kindness to male courtiers is reframed as sexual impropriety, you begin to question your own memory, your own sanity. Anne's ladies-in-waiting, the women who attended her during these final days, left accounts that revealed just how psychological the torture became. They described a woman who would laugh at inappropriate moments, who seemed almost detached from her own impending death. Modern trauma specialists would recognize these as classic symptoms of dissociation, the mind's way of protecting itself from unbearable psychological pressure. But Henry wasn't content with just breaking Anne psychologically. He wanted to destroy her reputation so thoroughly that history itself would justify his actions. Court propagandists worked overtime to transform the woman who had once been celebrated for her wit and intelligence into a scheming adulteress. Poets who had once praised her beauty suddenly discovered her hidden corruption. Musicians who had performed at her coronation now composed ballads about her downfall. The most chilling part of this character assassination was how systematic it became. Henry didn't just want Anne dead, he wanted her erased. Portrait painters received instructions to destroy images of her. Stone masons chiseled her royal emblems from palace walls. Even mentioning her name in court became dangerous. It was as if Henry believed he could retroactively undo their marriage, their relationship, even her very existence. Meanwhile, Anne's co-accused faced their own horrors. 5 men, including her brother George Boleyn, were arrested on equally fabricated charges. Their executions, scheduled just days before Anne's own, served a dual purpose. First, they established the facts of Anne's alleged crimes before she could contradict them. Second, they demonstrated to Anne exactly what awaited her, a final psychological blow designed to ensure her complete submission. The treatment of these men reveals just how far Henry's cruelty extended. These weren't criminals caught in the act. They were courtiers, musicians, and nobles whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the king needed scapegoats. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, was tortured until he confessed to adultery with the queen. The other men maintained their innocence, even as they mounted the scaffold, but by then it was too late. The narrative was set. As Anne's execution date approached, the psychological pressure intensified in ways that seem almost designed by experts in mental torture. The date was changed multiple times, creating an agonizing uncertainty about when death would finally come. One day she would prepare herself to die, only to be told the execution was postponed. Then it would happen again and again, each delay extending her suffering while maintaining the constant threat of imminent death. This wasn't mercy. This was calculated cruelty designed to keep Anne in a state of maximum psychological distress. Every dawn could be her last. Every footstep in the corridor might be the guards coming to fetch her. Every conversation with her ladies might be their final words together. The psychological warfare reached its most insidious peak when Henry made a decision that reveals the true depths of his cruelty. He imported a French swordsman from Calais specifically for Anne's execution. Now, you might think this sounds merciful. After all, the French method was supposedly cleaner, more efficient than the traditional English axe. But that interpretation misses the point entirely. This wasn't mercy. This was theater. Henry wanted Anne's death to be a performance worthy of international attention, and he spared no expense to ensure the spectacle would be remembered. The swordsman himself commanded an enormous fee, equivalent to several years' wages for a common laborer. But more importantly, this foreign executioner represented yet another form of psychological torture for Anne. In her final moments, she wouldn't even face death at the hands of someone familiar. The executioner was a stranger who spoke a different language, followed different customs, wielded an unfamiliar weapon. Even in death, Anne would be denied the comfort of English tradition. She would die as she had lived in her final days, isolated and alienated from everything she had once known. The morning of May 19th arrived with cruel irony. London awakened to brilliant sunshine, the kind of perfect spring day that makes you grateful to be alive. Birds sang in the Tower Gardens. Merchants called out their wares in the streets beyond the fortress walls. Life continued its ordinary rhythm while Anne Boleyn prepared to leave it forever. But inside the tower, nothing was ordinary. Anne had been awake since before dawn, her sleep shattered by nightmares and anxiety. Her ladies reported that she had requested communion at 2 a.m, kneeling before the altar for hours in desperate prayer. By sunrise, she had already been conscious for nearly a full day, her mind fractured by exhaustion and terror. When the tower lieutenant arrived to escort her to the scaffold, witnesses described something that still sends chills down historians' spines. Anne was laughing. Not the bitter laugh of resignation, or even the hysterical laugh of madness. She seemed almost cheerful, joking with her ladies about how she would soon be known as Anne Sans Teat, Anne without a head. This gallows humor masked what modern psychologists would recognize as a complete psychological break from reality. The walk to Tower Green took only minutes, but for Anne it must have felt eternal. Every step carried her further from the life she had known, and closer to an end she could barely comprehend. The same stones beneath her feet had supported her during happier times. The same walls had witnessed her triumph. Now they would witness her destruction. The scaffold itself had been constructed with deliberate humiliation in mind. Unlike the towering platforms typically used for noble executions, Anne's scaffold stood barely 3 feet off the ground. This wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated insult designed to rob her of dignity even in death. She wouldn't tower above the crowd in her final moments. She would kneel at their level, reduced from queen to common criminal. The crowd that gathered represented one of the most disturbing aspects of Tudor justice. These weren't spontaneous mourners or even natural spectators. Many had been deliberately encouraged to attend, told that they would witness the just punishment of an adulteress and traitor. Court officials had spent weeks crafting public opinion, ensuring that Anne's death would be received not as tragedy, but as righteous justice. Standing on that low scaffold, Anne delivered her final speech to the assembled crowd. But even these last words weren't truly her own. Every sentence had to be carefully calculated, not just for her own legacy, but for the safety of those she left behind. Her daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, had already been declared illegitimate. Any defiant words from Anne could make the child's situation even more precarious. So Anne spoke words of submission that must have tasted like poison on her tongue. She praised Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord, words that anyone who knew their history together would recognize as bitter irony. She asked the crowd to pray for the king, the same man who had orchestrated her destruction through lies and fabricated evidence. Even in her final moments, she was forced to perform, to play the role of the grateful subject accepting just punishment. The blindfold that was placed over her eyes has often been described as a final mercy, sparing her the sight of the approaching sword. But consider the alternative interpretation. That blindfold prevented Anne from seeing exactly when death would come, forcing her to wait in darkness for a blow that could fall at any second. She knelt upright, following French custom, her neck exposed and vulnerable, unable to anticipate the moment of impact. In those final seconds, as she knelt in prayer with the blindfold obscuring her vision, Anne Boleyn experienced something that transcends historical analysis. The woman who had changed the course of English history, who had defied convention to marry a king, who had given birth to the future Elizabeth I, was reduced to a kneeling figure waiting for death. The ultimate victory of Henry's psychological campaign wasn't just that he killed her. It was that he had stripped away everything that made her who she was. The French executioner raised his sword with practiced precision. In a moment, centuries of speculation and historical debate would begin. But for Anne, in that instant before the blade fell, there was only the overwhelming reality of a life about to end, a consciousness about to be extinguished, and the terrible knowledge that even her death had been choreographed by the man she had once loved. What happened next would shock even the hardened witnesses who thought they had seen everything the Tudor court could offer in terms of brutality and spectacle. The true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution was only beginning. The sword fell with a whisper, not the dramatic clash you might expect from centuries of romanticized retellings. In that single, precise moment, Henry VIII achieved what months of psychological warfare had been building toward. Anne Boleyn's head was severed cleanly from her body, but the horror didn't end there. Witnesses reported that her eyes continued to blink, her lips moving as if trying to form words, for nearly 30 seconds after the blade completed its work. The consciousness that had once commanded kingdoms lingered in those final, impossible moments, trapped in a severed head that could no longer scream. Perhaps the most chilling detail of all was what happened immediately after. No proper coffin had been prepared for a queen's remains. Her terrified ladies, still reeling from what they had witnessed, scrambled to find an old arrow chest to hold her body and severed head. Even in death, Anne Boleyn was an afterthought, a political problem solved rather than a human life mourned. Henry's campaign of erasure had succeeded beyond his wildest ambitions. Within hours of Anne's death, he was celebrating his engagement to Jane Seymour. The woman who had defied convention, challenged the Catholic Church, and given birth to England's greatest queen, had been reduced to a footnote in her husband's quest for a male heir. But here's the ultimate irony that Henry could never have foreseen. His attempt to erase Anne Boleyn from history ensured that her story would be told for centuries. The very brutality he unleashed upon her became the foundation of her lasting legacy. Today, more people know Anne Boleyn's name than remember Henry's other 5 wives. Her daughter Elizabeth would become England's greatest monarch, ruling for 45 years and ushering in a golden age that made England a global power. The psychological torture, the fabricated charges, the systematic character assassination, and the theatrical execution all backfired in ways that would have infuriated the king who orchestrated them. Anne Boleyn's death reveals uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and the lengths to which authority will go to maintain control. But it also demonstrates something Henry never understood. You can destroy a person, but you cannot destroy the questions their life and death force us to confront. Standing in the shadows of history, watching Anne Boleyn's final walk to the scaffold, we witness more than just a Tudor execution. We see the eternal struggle between truth and power, between individual dignity and state authority, between those who seek to control the narrative and those whose stories refuse to stay buried. Anne Boleyn's execution was far more horrifying than we think, but perhaps more importantly, her legacy proved far more powerful than Henry ever imagined.